hard. So, ladies and gentlemen, to tell you the truth, we've reached our last session, our last panel. The hours have gone by, and we are picking up exactly where Kochav finished, that anti-Semitism that we see surging worldwide, and it's like a paradox. You don't really get it. How come after October 7th there's a rise in anti-Semitism? Of course, it started even before the war and all the events in Gaza. So the next panel, and is our last panel, will be about this, the international legitimacy and anti-Semitism, and I'd like to invite some very impressive individuals. First of all, the Professor Irwin Cotler, who's just been mentioned by Kochav.
Minister of Justice in
Canada, and a person with so many things to his credit, and who's involved in anti-Semitism. Ofir Dayan, the writer of the book Intifada on the Hudson. Joanna, Landau, the head of the Abba, Eban policy for diplomacy and foreign relations in the Reichman Institute. Ambassador Eylon and Eylon, Eylon Levy, the head of the civics spokesmanship, and this panel will be moderated by no other than Roni Malkai. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel. Hello, distinguished guests. Why don't we start with Professor Cotler? I'd like to start with you because you're the only one among us who lives overseas, and we'd like to hear, how is it like to be a Jew today, not in the state of Israel, with everything that's happening with anti-Semitism and violence? So we'd like to hear from you about that. And you can speak in English.
I can translate it while you speak, but I will ask in Hebrew and you can speak in English like we said. So thank you.
I'll speak in English, not because I don't respect the Hebrew language, but because I do respect the Hebrew language.
Let me begin really where Kochav ended, and I really want to commend her for an outstanding address and for being in the trenches all these years. Kol hakavod. So we are meeting really at a historical inflection moment with regard to the struggle against anti-Semitism. We meet not only, as has been said, on the eve of the 700th day of the unspeakable mass atrocities of October 7th, spoken of as the worst day in Israeli and Jewish history since the Holocaust, of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened, as Kochav authenticated in the most evidence-based, legally grounded report I've ever seen, and I say this as somebody who prosecuted the worst of sexual atrocities in Rwanda and elsewhere. One would have expected that, given these unspeakable mass atrocities, that this would have resulted in a uniform global condemnation, that it would have resulted in international action. On the contrary, what we have observed, and beginning on October 8th, was a denial even that these atrocities took place, or support for them, or justification for them, or even glorification and celebration of them in the global and public square. Of unspeakable atrocities perpetrated not only by a terrorist organization, Hamas, but by a genocidal, anti-Semitic terrorist statelet, not because I say so, but because Hamas has said so in its founding charter of 1988 and since. And where, beginning on October 8th, Hamas has said that it will commit October 7th again and again and again until Israel's annihilation. One would have hoped as well that would have been a combating of this anti-Semitism. On the contrary, what we have witnessed since October 8th, and I say this as somebody who was special envoy for the combating investigation, we have witnessed an unprecedented global explosion of anti-Semitism. Let me give you, you asked about it, let me give you just a case study in Canada, but it is true in other democracies, where we are witnessing the highest level of anti-Semitic incidences ever recorded. In Canada, 8,200 anti-Semitic instances in 2025 alone. That's 17 a day. It's not just a matter of abstract statistics. We have to understand those who are the targets of such anti-Semitism. And we are witnessing the highest level of hate crimes ever recorded. In Canada, where Canadian Jews are 1% of the population, Canadian Jews are the target of 72% of all hate-motivated crimes. And where Jews as a minority are 25 times more likely to be the target of a hate crime than any other group in Canada. And it doesn't end there. These are not only hate crimes, they are horrific crimes of violence. We are meeting on the occasion of the anniversary of the murders of two U.S. Embassy staffers in Washington. We are meeting on the anniversary of the murder of the hostage and the March for Hostages in Boulder, Colorado. I can go on. And so let me close and say, what is so necessary now? Because what we have
We'll go back to it later, what is necessary. I just want to talk now, to take what you said, and ask Joanna, מה עושים בעצם? הוא מתאר...
What do we do now? He's describing a reality that's very, very difficult, a reality that we haven't seen for many, many years. What can be done, Joanna? What can we do? It's a simple question. It's an easy question. I'll speak both in Hebrew and in English.
A panel about anti-Semitism, and the anti-Semitism that is experienced much more by the Jews around the world than it is by us Israelis, even though, of course, we're in that as well. There are front lines that the Jews are experiencing outside of Israel that we in Israel experience in a different way. You asked what can be done. I think it's a mindset issue. I've established an institute here at Reichman called the Reputational Security Lab, which is in the Abba Eban Institute for Diplomacy and Foreign Relations. And I look at this whole issue of anti-Semitism, legitimacy, as a national capability that Israel has to develop at a much, much higher level because of the stakes. And the stakes are that it's not just about Israel, and it's not just about the Jews outside of Israel. It's in fact about all democracies at large, dealing with a kind of clash of civilizations, and we are, as usual, the canary in the coal mine. So if we have a mindset that says that this is an hasbara issue, or hasbara in English, or it's a public diplomacy, or it's a branding issue, which is my expertise, I think we will stay in the same place. We have to change our mindset that the reputation of Israel and the Jewish people, by extension, is a national security asset. It's a national security challenge. And as long as we don't see it as seriously as we see the issues with the Iranian atom bomb and so on, then we will never get the funding for it, the expertise of the people. We need to have an entire infrastructure for Israel that has to be completely reformed. What we currently have in place to deal with what the Jewish people and Israel are facing is not suitable for the challenge of the 21st century. We need a much stronger security apparatus in this realm of the narrative building. We need a much stronger ability to connect with and create allies. There are many allies out there, and we're consistently going against those who will never agree with us anyway. We need to build relationships. We need to look at this much more professionally. We have to have a national branding project. We have to have the equivalent of a Mossad, Shabak, IDF, and so on. It's a short question, but a very long answer.
Thank you so much. Ofir, אני רוצה לשאול אותה.
I'd like to ask you, Ofir, you're actually a graduate of Columbia University, which is well known for its anti-Semitic incidents and activities against Jews, and it's constantly presented as if these occurrences started after October 7th, but you were there long before that, and you experienced before that incidents, anti-Semitic incidents. So we would like to hear a bit about life in campus in Columbia University. Well, I don't know if we're holding this panel in Hebrew, in English, whatever you say, in Hebrew. Okay, so as proper disclosure, I'd like to say you introduced me by the name of the book I recently wrote in the Yediot Achronot publishing house, Intifada on the Hudson. I'll say to everybody, this is a frank disclosure. I think I started writing that book in 2019 when I was a student in Columbia, and I led the students, the organization of students supporting Israel. And I looked around, and what I saw was chaos. I saw this is some massive event that my friends at home, even my family, are not aware of. And my father, he'll have to excuse me for doing that. He was then in a diplomatic role in New York, and I remember talking with him and telling him what was happening in the university. And he said, Ofir, you know what? I think you're exaggerating. And I insisted that I wasn't exaggerating, and because I felt that there was something different there. And I'll explain what I meant. After October 7th, we were all appalled to see Israeli flags that instead of the Star of David, they had the swastika. They already had that in Columbia in 2017. In 2018 or 19, and some people broke into a professor, a researcher of the Holocaust, and they sprayed red swastikas all over her office walls, along with the word Jude. And this is an office in a building that you need a student card or a professor's card to enter that building, and that happened back in 2018. I can give you some more examples, but these are the strongest ones for us as students who acted together with me, students who were supporters of Israel. There were various false complaints submitted against them on violence and sexual harassment. They couldn't do that to me. I'm 48 years old. The chances of me harassing anyone was quite slim, but they would put up these posters with my face. And, you know, speaking of patterns, we saw after October 7th, we saw that posters with the faces of hostages were ripped off. And when Ori Ansbacher, of blessed memory, was murdered long before October 7th, I put up posters with her picture and explanation about what happened to her in order to raise awareness, and then 2 hours later I came, and all of these were torn down, all the posters. So things we saw after October 7th, we saw even before. So why did I start telling you about this book? Because I started putting all of that in writing in 2017, and when I came to publishers in Israel and I talked about that topic, I got one of two answers. The first answer was, these are 18-year-old kids, it'll pass. And the second answer, even if it won't pass, what do we care what they think about us? You know, who cares about that? And I'd like to relate to what Joanna just said, because it doesn't pass. We see Congress members, senators, 18 years old, 19 years old, and even Bernie Sanders, who's past the age of 70, and it still stays with them. This hostility towards Israel is a danger to Israeli national security, because we see these votes of Democratic representatives voting against assistance to Israel. We hear the VP, the Vice President of the U.S., who is not 18 years old, standing on the most important stages in the world, talking about Israel, and I think any Israeli who watched this was terrified. And so it doesn't pass. And of course we care about it. Of course it should interest us, because it's a danger to Israeli national security. And I think that October 7th, in a certain sense, and I'm saying that with great regret, led us to open up our eyes to these processes that occurred there. And let me say one last thing. It's true that everything that we saw before October 7th, we didn't see in the same intensity that we're seeing now. But I think, and it's important for me to say this, but October 7th really didn't invent anything new, this hatred. And it's important for me to say it's not only towards the current government, it's towards that government as well, but not only to the 67 boundaries, but 48, because when they chant, we don't want two-state, we want 48, they're not talking about the government or the settlements. They are negating the right of a Jewish state to exist, because they do not perceive the Jews as a nation, as a people who deserve their own sovereign state. So that was true before October 7th, it's true now after October 7th, and we need to focus all our efforts and solutions on that point. Thank you, Ofir. And still it's important to say that when we hear ministers from the government making these extreme statements. It impacts the Jews in the diaspora. It's important to say that as well. It doesn't help, it harms them. We don't have a representative from the government who can talk about that, but maybe we can talk about what the government can do. And now I'd like to move on to Eylon. Eylon, how come civil public diplomacy? Because we have the foreign ministry, we have the Ministry of the Diaspora, the public diplomacy department in the Prime Minister's office, and various agencies that are supposed to address Israeli public diplomacy and to change its state. So how come the citizens of the State of Israel are supposed to do the work that the government is supposed to do? First of all, maybe you saw me making a face because I was hoping that we won't say that term in Hebrew, hasbara, which means public diplomacy. Some people claim that the only problem is that the images are difficult, and this is why people are against us. And if we only explain ourselves, people will listen. And I heard the importance this morning saying that we won't have extremists in the next government who will say to drop an atomic bomb, a nuclear bomb on Gaza. That will be helpful. But this thought that maybe if not Tishbi appears on TV, and I'm saying her as a code name for anybody else, all of a sudden they'll start booing at Jews traveling in Italy or calling them baby killers. That's unrealistic, and it ignores what's happening here. There's an information war being waged against the State of Israel through the institutions with the strongest reputation in the world. There are many people in the world right now who are convinced that Israel has this secret plan to train dogs to rape Palestinian prisoners because they read that in an opinion column in the New York Times of a person whose expertise is not the Middle East. That's important to mention that. But even an opinion letter is edited by the editor, and he is entrenched in his position. I think it's despicable that the New York Times went along with it. I made a subscription to the New York Times just so that I could cancel it in protest. And a few weeks ago, when they placed Israel in the UN in the blacklist of countries using sexual violence, and Pramila Patton was asked in a press conference, did you see the evidence of that? And she said, no, it's not my job to corroborate the information. And we can see now, just a week ago, yet another report of another UN committee that states that Israel is conducting genocide because it is intentionally targeting children without any shred of evidence. You can read the report, entire pages without even one footnote, and it's completely clear that they started out with the conclusion that Israel is to be blamed, and then they managed to distort the facts to prove that. And these extremist ministers are indeed damaging us with these terrible comments. And even President Herzog, who said that there's an entire nation responsible, they managed to take it in the UN to say that he incited for genocide, even though in that same press conference he said, I believe that there are many civilians in Gaza who are innocent. But this was perceived as the narrative all over the world, and this is why there were protests and demonstrations against him when he visited Australia. They said that he said there are no innocent civilians in Gaza, but actually he never said that. So we're living in a reality that even a reasonable, normative person who's open to our position wants Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and the UN and Save the Children and Feed the Puppies and House the Homeless, and these organizations who have a much stronger and better reputation than the State of Israel say that it is our fault. Who will they believe? Where does the average person get their information from? Wikipedia. And right now there's a war going on to simply demolish Jewish history and Wikipedia, to completely re-edit, to get us to look like Nazi monsters, so that the average individual in Britain and France and everywhere else think that we need to be completely annihilated. But you still haven't answered my question, Eylon. Why do we need a civilian or civic public diplomacy? See, I have an interest to say everything's bad in the State of Israel. It doesn't do anything. But today they appointed my dear friend Doron Spielman to be the spokesperson of the International Public Diplomacy Forum. I hope we'll see him. I think it's an excellent appointment, and I do hope that we will see more results. But it's crazy that it's only happening now after 3 years of war. I think that at the beginning of the war, there wasn't an understanding of why it's important to fight over international national global opinion because we felt, okay, they won't like us. We don't need the sympathy of the average person in Canada, but it's a mistake because when they pressure their leaders not to sell arms to us and not to trade with us, that's a problem. We always need the citizens to speak up in favor of the country. I don't think that public diplomacy is a service of the welfare state, that the state can speak on our behalf and the citizens can sit at home. People need to say there are things here that are unrelated to the government. It's a broad national interest, and hopefully then there will be a new government after the elections. Understand how important this is and that we must storm global public opinion because we're facing a terrible problem, and like Ofir said, it's a genuine threat to Israel's national security.
What Israel can do to change the situation?
I
יש
think-
משהו לעשות?
Is there something we can do?
We can change the situation.
And just to follow up, at this point, we have to realize that this eighth front is the internationalization of the delegitimization of Israel. And that anti-Semitism, in a word, is being laundered also under the protective cover of the United Nations, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, under the struggle of So what we have to do is to say at this point, number one, with regard to the UN, I'll never forget what Kofi Annan told me over 20 years ago when I was Minister of Justice, when he said, a United Nations that does not put the combating of anti-Semitism at the forefront of its responsibilities is a United Nations that has forfeited its past and has betrayed its future. And we have to make that case internationally through the United Nations International. So with regard to the community of democracies, we have to tell them that they have a responsibility for a whole of government action, not simply performative tweets, not simply virtue signaling, but action. And the reason for action is not just because anti-Semitism is a threat to Jews, and with this I'll close. It's because anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies. So if a democracy wants to defend itself, it has to combat anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a threat to the national security of democracies, to the individual and collective security of its citizens. So a democracy that is setting forth a national security policy and plan has to put the combating of anti-Semitism in that national security. A civil society, the NGOs that want to retain their integrity, have to put anti-Semitism at the forefront of what it does. Otherwise, it's a threat also to the work of human rights and anti-Semitism. So I close by saying that we've always said, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so it has to be a collective responsibility at the international level and in each and all of the community of democracies.
אפשר להוסיף פה מילה?
Can I please add something? Yes, of course.
כמובן שהמגפה
Certainly, the world pandemic of anti-Semitism is terrible and awful, but we need to distinguish between two phenomena. Some are anti-Semitic, full-fledged, against Jews and so on, but there is something more sophisticated. A phenomenon that says, I'm not against Jews, I'm against Zionism, which is a force, and of course you can't understand the motif of Jews murdering babies without the whole past of the Middle Ages, but I am against this colonialist apartheid state called Israel, and Zionism, I'm not against Jews. And then they pose a challenge to the Jews, and they ask them to pass the test. We will accept you as Jews if you will condemn and turn your back to Israel. And so we are seeing a phenomenon of Scott Wiener, a person I don't know if I should feel compassion for or contempt for. He has been given so much criticism from the radical left that after months of refusing to say Israel is doing genocide, he admitted that it was. It didn't make a difference because they kept going after him even though he gave his pound of flesh and did whatever he was asked to do. So there are these two phenomena. There is the classic anti-Semitism and the anti-Zionism, which is of course a new way of hating Jews, but in a much more more convincing way that tells itself it's not anti-Semitic, they're on the right side of the map. It's the contemporary anti-Semitism we keep hearing about. I would recommend all the listeners to simply try, when someone says something about Zionists, just replace the word Zionist with Jew. If it works out with some ancient conspiracy theory or some trope about Jews, anti-Semitic stereotype, then they probably didn't mean to be anti-Zionists in the first place. Joanna, you talked a lot about social safety, cognitive security. How do you do that? How do you generate this cognitive security that you're talking about as something that can really change and alter? How do you do this? Well, it connects to what Owen called information warfare, because there's no truth anymore, there are no facts anymore. What can we base? I don't even know where use that word, hasbara, anymore. We have to really stop using it. It's irrelevant anymore. No longer calling it hasbara would be the right thing to do. But there are many ways of doing this. I want to talk about a minute what we talked about and mention it, because we're in a panel that talks about anti-Semitism, and we're talking about this, but maybe we'll be upset to learn that most of the world doesn't care. They don't care anymore. They don't care about anti-Semitism in the world anymore. And we want to ask them to care, and because it's a real test of the reality for the health of democracy, but they don't see it. We don't speak a language that is relevant to what they care about, and that is why we are losing and have been losing many of the younger generation. We're just talking a language that is only relevant to us and makes us feel good, and we'll do this everywhere. We'll have such meetings every day. I've been in this area for 15, 20 years, and we're just talking and talking to no avail. We have to see why our challenge is the same challenge as other countries, and to forge alliances with other countries so that they too will want the value that we can bring to the table. For instance, give us an example, because you're saying they don't care about anti-Semitism, so how can we, what is the common denominator if they don't have anti-Semitism? Well, for example, if you have countries on the border with Russia, they too have foreign impact. Taiwan also has foreign impact from China, Ukraine, and so on. These countries are already active against disinformation and misinformation more than we are, because they already know how to contend with it. Now there, from first grade, you learn at school digital literacy against foreign impact, foreign influence. And with AI, we don't no longer know whether we're talking with real people, but they've already developed capabilities that we can learn from. But we also have capabilities, intelligence capabilities, and the whole world of security. With a startup nation, we could develop capabilities that come from trust tech. It's a whole world. We can build a whole industry that will also generate great income for us. We have to find bridges and ties with the world to become relevant, and I think that would be the basis for our success, because alone we're too small, we will not succeed. And another thing, on the government level, I also come from the civil world. 15 years I had an NGO, I promoted Israel around the world. It's wonderful, it's lovely, but most of the time I was busy raising funds, and the philanthropic world is very active, but still 2.5 years after October 7th, it doesn't really know what to do, because there's no strategy, there's no overall thinking, no one knows where we're headed, and that is what the government's job is. The government has to assume responsibility for that. If you tomorrow morning would meet the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Prime Minister, what would you tell them? What should be the first thing they should do in order, because you're saying it's the government's job, and it certainly is, but what do they need to do tomorrow morning in order for this situation to start changing? Well, what I want to say is that this thinking, what I should do tomorrow morning, what I should do in the first 100 days, what I should do in the first year, is a very tactical way of thinking, very Israeli, very short range. We need to be building a strategy for the next 50 years on this issue, for 100 years, just like our enemies are doing. If we continue with this tactics of what we're going to do tomorrow morning, this is going to remain a problem, and that's why Ofir and the INSS and many other research institutes are talking about a strategy that takes into account the Jewish world, and we really develop a strategy. It takes 4 or 5 months to do this. And if I were the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I would build a strategic plan. However, if I were the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in 3 months' time, there's elections, so what's the use of a strategic plan now? What will I do with it? So on this optimistic note, I would like to ask Professor Cotler. We talked about the diaspora Jews, and Joanna also mentioned the Jewish world and how important it is. How do you view things? How do you view the relationship between the Jews in the diaspora and the State of Israel? There is a problem here that is trickling down and is constant from Israel to the diaspora. They don't feel like Israel is there for them, and all sorts of decisions that have been made in recent years are pointing to that. So what is happening there in the world? What can connect us back to the Jews of the world?
Israel diaspora thing, what we're witnessing is, and this has been going on for years now, is, the indictment of Israel as a racist, colonialist, settler, child-killing, apartheid, genocidal state. And what is necessary now for Jews in the diaspora and for Israel? What we need to do, not just in terms of the combating of anti-Semitism, as I spoke, but we need to affirm our own identity. In other words, that the Jewish people are a prototypical indigenous people, a people that still inhabits the same land, embraces the same religion, studies the same Bible, hearkens to the same indigenous prophets, speaks the same indigenous language Hebrew, and bears the same indigenous name Israel as we did 3,500 years ago. That has to be a core part of our affirmation of identity, Israel and diaspora. The second thing is we are a prototypical anti-colonial people. A people that has been enslaved, persecuted, etc., also for 3,000 years. And the final thing is that we need to affirm, and you are yourself a representative, that Israel is a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious, multi-linguistic, Jewish, democratic, Zionist state. That has to be at the core of our affirmation.
Can I add something very quickly? Let me just say that I agree with Professor Cotler. We had a discussion before that we keep talking about diversity in Israel, and it's a country that's multicultural, and we don't see it around the world. When I go overseas, people are astonished. What? You come from Israel? Because they look at my skin color, they think everyone here is blonde with blue eyes, and we're all Europeans, and we are all colonizers.
The diversity of Israelis and the Ethiopian Jews from Israel, we can do really, I know you don't like the word hasbara, but still it's hasbara, so we can do a lot of hasbara, so they need to use the Ethiopian Jews. That's what we talked about. That's what you meant about the diversity. Can Joanna?
Yes, Joanna. I just wanted to add to what Professor Irwin Cotler has said. He's talking about a story. What's our narrative? What's our story? We need to define it. And it's a process, and in the area I specialize in, which is nation branding, it's a professional process that is done professionally. It takes about 8 months. It costs about $700,000-$800,000. It's a lot of story building, and there's an outcome, and then we can all go with this outcome and tell this story. And the small thing I would like to add to what you said is that our story has to be relevant and attractive to our target audiences, which we would like to impact. It can't just be our story. If the state of Israel will keep going around saying nation state of the Jewish people, if you're not Jewish, it's not relevant to you, and therefore you have no reason to defend it. So we don't just want these people. There are ways of telling this narrative. Because we only have 5 minutes, so Ofir and then Eylon, and then we'll wrap up this forum. Ofir. Perhaps you'd like to say what you think. I want to address some of the things that have been said. I definitely agree. And I think that the story, a story or a narrative that first of all unites us, that we can all stand behind is one thing, and a story that also attracts outwardly is the second thing. And I think that what the story or narrative that Irwin has talked about, indigeneity, human rights, anti-colonialism, is a narrative that can certainly be attractive for audiences outside of Israel too. And unfortunately, I look at this and say the state of Israel apparently has made a decision that the identity politics is something from the leftists are all about, and we're ignoring the fact that every single minority in the world is using identity politics and its unique attributes to demand the rights they deserve. And only the state of Israel and the Jewish people have decided that they don't want to play this game. Now, we can't demand that we also get a hand in this card game if we're not going to sit at the table, and if everybody's playing identity politics, and the state of Israel is the only one who's not going to tell this story. And with all the respect I have for high-tech and Israeli innovation, has decided that it's going for a narrative of innovation instead of indigenousness, then of course, why should people say that we're indigenous? And I want to tell you one more thing, Roni. Please, briefly. Okay, very briefly. I feel that I will not be doing my duty here on this panel if I don't talk about this. And you asked Irwin about the diaspora Jews, and I feel that often when I sit on panels with people who do belong to the world Jewry, they don't feel comfortable saying what I'm going to say, and perhaps you don't feel this way, so I'm just putting words in your mouth. But the state of Israel, not only under the current government, but also under it, in the recent years, has really not done its job as the Jewish state, because it continues to strengthen its status as the state of Israelis. And I'm challenging everyone here in this room and at home to see when was the last time that a minister or a prime minister have gone to a reform or conservative synagogue. I want to give you just one example. Rabbi Ami Hirsch, who 2 weeks ago said that the reform movement should stop authorizing rabbis, and that the reform movement should be teaching Zionism instead of Tikkun Olam. And Rabbi Amir Hirsch is not there in different forums, and we have lost touch, and we have not done the thing that we should have done, the most basic thing we should have done. And I want to finish with one thing. If you take away one thing from what I've said today, please let it be this sentence: we cannot go and yell Am Yisrael Chai and then go back home, close the door, and break down this chain of generations of 500 years. Because breaking away and tearing away the Jewish people from the half of the nation that is not living in Israel is exactly the opposite of Am Yisrael Chai. The state of Israel has a moral duty. Ofir, I'm sorry, I have to stop you. Okay, Eylon, I'm going to say three things. First of all, Ofir is right in everything she says, but I disagree with Joanna. I think that with $1 million budget, through PR companies, we could find a great narrative that we can market outwardly for Israel. But it's irrelevant if it's not a story that we can embrace and foster as the people. That's the basis. We, as a society, are divided on what we're doing here and what the purpose of this country is and where we're going. And so any narrative that we'll come up with will be challenged internally, domestically, by the coalition, by the Knesset, because other people will be telling other stories and we're not very obedient. Look, we're not the only country. Everywhere in the world they do have this, but we are argumentative. Already here on this panel there is an internal disagreement. But about the world Jewry, for most world Jews, Israel is something far away. And for many of them, we have to admit that Judaism is also far away, because many of them are unaffiliated. Now, the biggest advantage the state of Israel has vis-a-vis the diaspora Jews is the ability to inspire them and make them proud. When they look at the state of Israel, I see the videos they show them, and in the different Jewish organization meetings, and we show them, wow, look what we can do when we work together. And the most dangerous thing for the state of Israel is when we make the world Jews feel ashamed, and our enemies know how to do that, how to make them feel ashamed of Israel. And the fact that these days the most famous Israeli politicians around the world after Bibi Netanyahu are Ben Gvir and Smotrich should be a red flag, because they are not the kind of people who make world Jews feel awe, feel pride, feel a desire to belong. Instead, they make them want to turn their back to the Zionist enterprise. And so as part of this challenge vis-a-vis the world Jewry, the state of Israel must think of how we can make them feel like they belong with awe and pride. Thank you, Eylon, for ending on an optimistic note and not with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So thank you, Eylon, Joanna, Ofir, and Professor Irwin Cotler. Thank you all very much.